hum the theme song. Won't hold it against you if you get parts wrong. While the memory's not too strong, there's a piece of you from a time long gone. So while these fuzzy warm feelings remain, question we ask is still the same. Is it a treasure or just plain lame? Is this still good?
Hello, and welcome back to Is This Still Good, a podcast about digging up childhood treasures and seeing if maybe we should be embarrassed for having buried them in the first place. I'm a host, Sage.
I'm a different host. My name's Gavin.
Same hosts still. I know, audience, that we said we were going to do an episode on Steve McQueen's Hunger this week. We're still hoping to do that, but the schedule got moved, and we're really trying to spend some time finding the right guest for that. And in fact, if you know a visual artist who's not annoying to talk to, if you could email in to stillgoodpod@gmail.com, I'm interested in going that route. But we're going to kind of save that for next year, which fits a little bit more into the theme that we're doing, which is making each other watch things that we're embarrassed that they haven't seen before.
That's right.
Kind of got an episode like that today. I'm really excited to see what you have picked out for me, Gavin. It's going to be real fun.
Mm-hmm.
We're timing something. Robert Zemeckis, who's always just making weird, innovative films of varying quality, he has a new film coming out this week called Here, which, as far as I could tell from the trailers, seemed to be a single camera and the eternity of time as told from that point of view. From before there's a house to where there's a house, to Robin Wright and Tom Hanks playing house in that house. So, Gavin, what if I told you that other films have done variations of this before? We just don't know about them because they are not from America.
It does seem like a bit of a tough sell, so sure. Show it to me.
Well, I wanted to do an episode that's truly for no one. I wanted to cover a movie that I wouldn't even know about if I hadn't been shown it in film school. And honestly, I was kind of surprised that you hadn't seen it in film school. And that is 2008's You the Living, a Swedish film by Roy Andersson, who seems very committed to this gimmick. And can you guess who I have as a guest today?
I mean, we're doing a bit where I don't see this gentleman already in the Zoom?
Yeah, or that he has his name up or anything.
He's been on the calendar for weeks.
The best guess I could possibly imagine bringing on is the person who showed me this film, my film history professor from Eastern Washington University, Dr. Pete Porter. Dr. Porter, how are you doing?
Doing great, Sage. How are you? Nice to meet you, Gavin.
Nice
On
to meet
the
you as
air,
well.
in person. Yeah.
Slightly sick, but very excited to talk about this, and really excited to see you again.
Yeah, it's a blast. It's been a blast.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you went a year or two after I graduated. You went to Amsterdam for a while.
I did. I was working on a book.
Yeah.
So that was 2017. That was a blast as well. Amsterdam is great, and Europe is great, and Netherlands are terrific. If I had a thing that I dislike, it would be cars. So Amsterdam is perfect for me because you can get anywhere without a car.
Oh, that must be a bummer to be back then.
I adjust.
So you were working on a book out there. I thought you were actually teaching in a film school out there. Did I have that wrong?
I had basically had a visiting scholar position at the University of Amsterdam the first time that I went, but I was basically working on a book. It's about animals in the movies.
Okay.
And so then I actually had a second professional leave 2 years ago, and I went to the University of Groningen, which is the university in the north, and still worked on the book. It's with peer review right now, so I'm hoping that finally comes out. But man, these things take forever, especially when you're chairing departments and teaching full load of classes and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, 2 years in the Netherlands to write a book, and then just to absorb all of the film culture that's there, which is amazing. I went to Cannes, I went to Annecy, I went to Kaboom, which is an animation festival in the Netherlands, went to IDFA. So it's just an amazing experience, which I would recommend. I mean, I know from seeing you on Facebook, like you do all kinds of travel as well. Travel is terrific. I think travel, I'd be a strong advocate of like 6 months at a time, a year at a time, because then you can really not just be touring.
Yeah.
Touring is great, But if you can stay longer, which is what we did, that was just amazing.
I'm really interested in how film school and film teaching would be different in Amsterdam versus here. Because even Gavin and I, along the West Coast, had very different film school backgrounds and experiences.
That's a good question. My understanding from being there for 2 years is that, at least in the Netherlands, there's a pretty clear boundary between film studies, which is University of Amsterdam, University of Groningen, which is where I was, and then some other places, versus like the national film technology or film tech approach. So the Netherlands Film Academy, basically, where it would be more production oriented. And there, when I was there last, there was some movements like maybe we could blend these a little bit more than we do, but for the most part, there's a stricter differentiation between film studies and film production.
When I studied abroad, I had my first choice. The place that I got into first was in England, and it was an academic, like a studies program. And I didn't really realize that until I read the fine print. And I did wind up going to Shanghai and focusing on production instead, because that was really what was interesting to me. But yeah, I did not realize that at first, and it felt very embarrassing going like, on second thought, guys.
I have to imagine British film studies and Chinese film production are two wildly different programs.
I would assume that you'd be correct.
I would say that all of that even so, like the Netherlands Film Academy, that was kind of like we do. They have a best of EWU, but they have a best of Dutch Film Academy. The films that they showed were just astonishingly good, and so the system works in a way.
And are we primarily talking about films in Dutch, made in Netherlands?
Yeah,
that's fascinating. Yeah, I don't have. We're obviously not talking about a Dutch movie today, and it would be dishonest to like really make a tight Venn diagram. I'm sure Swedish and Dutch culture and films are quite different. Although, most importantly, they're both not films from the United States.
Yeah, that again, that seems to me to be a huge difference. I mean, America has just an enormous film industry, and most of it's still focused in Los Angeles, where you are, but also moving around the country as well. And that's kind of different in Europe.
Well, we always like to ask before we go into a film what everyone's connection to the film is and where they were when they first saw it. I was obviously in a little screening theater outside of Spokane, Washington, where you were showing this to me. Gavin, I'm very jealous of how you got to watch this. Would you like to tell my dear film school professor the ideal settings that you watched this movie?
So I was watching this yesterday in the green room at the Wiltern, which is a concert venue in Los Angeles. I didn't have headphones in, so it was competing a tiny bit with the sound of the opening band Vagabond, who was playing before. I was shooting a concert for Crumb last night.
I didn't even know you didn't have headphones, Gavin. That's so much worse.
It was. I could hear. I mean, I was reading subtitles the whole time anyway. But
that's fair.
Yeah, no, I closed the door. But yeah.
All right. Well, now that we've called you out, I'm very curious.
Thanks.
That's all I wanted to do. I just wanted to embarrass you a little bit. I'm very curious, Porter, how this film came across and why you decided it would be an interesting teaching tool for film history.
So I first saw You the Living in Vancouver at the Vancouver International Film Festival. Would have been 2008 probably. Mm-hmm. And I, got to see it in the most pristine possible presentation. And a fellow programmer that I know, Mark Parenson, was like, he just said, tablecloth trick, you got to watch this movie. And so I went to see the movie, and I was just waiting for the tablecloth trick. And then there's no preparation that you can give someone, and nor would you want to prepare them ultimately for this scene, but it just blows my mind every time that I see it. And so then Spokane International Film Festival, we brought the film to the US. We couldn't get it in time for the festival proper because everything in 2008 was a 35 millimeter print. Okay, so either you have a 35 millimeter print of a film from Sweden in the United States that you can get to Spokane, Washington, or you don't. Mm-hmm. And so how many prints of You the Living are there in 35 millimeter in the world now? How many were there then? Anyway, so we ended up showing it as a standalone film, like in the spring after SPIFF had run. and we watched that in the Magic Lantern in Spokane. It was just amazing. So that was the pristine possible experience of that film. And it's a really demanding film, to put it mildly. It's saying you're going to watch film in a completely different way than you've ever watched film. There are lots of short forms like this
Yeah.
that are just a single shot, or even 30 seconds or something, or like an advertisement. So Roy Andersson really supports himself by making advertisements. And that's kind of how he created the style. He did one film in a more standard continuity style, but then he's like, this isn't the way that I want to make a movie. I want to make a movie like this, where I'm going to set up the camera, and then I'm going to have an idea of what this looks like. And then I'm going to build a set, and I'm going to stage it. I'm going to costume it. I'm going to set design the heck out of this thing. Then I'm going to shoot it. And if I don't like it, I'm going to tear down that set, and I'm going to rebuild the entire thing, and then put the camera in the perfect exact place. So not only does he build these amazing sets and then shoot them from a static camera, if he doesn't like how it looks, he will redo the whole thing, which to me is just mind-boggling, the amount of energy that this takes. And so he has his own studio, and that's what he does. He just builds these amazing sets and then creates this complete world. But if you're not, so many films today rely on what I think of as the orientation effect, where you have a cut and there's a split second where your brain has to reorient itself. And so there's an interruption in your cognitive processing of the scene. Well, Roy Andersson is like, no interruptions. You are going to look at the scene. I'm not going to give you the dopamine hit of, I was just looking at a long shot. Now I'm going to look at a medium shot. He doesn't do that at all. You have to decide what you're going to look at in almost exclusively long takes with static cameras. So I'm really interested to see what Zemeckis does with this, if that is in fact what he does. But I might have jumped ahead a little bit because we didn't give much of an orientation to the film itself. But sorry.
Well, I mean, this is usually a Gavin job, where he goes through the plot of the film for anyone who might not have seen it. I think that's an impossible task, to actually summarize the plot of this film, what happens in the order that happens, because it is ultimately a vignette of people living in a town in Sweden, in Leith.
I mean, what you just said is kind of how I was going to summarize it. So
I was worried about that as it was happening. I was going to ask you to pitch this movie, not necessarily favorably or unfavorably, but how you would explain this to someone else. To let's say if you're watching it on your laptop in the green room and someone pops over your shoulder, how you would explain it.
They're like, what is that? Yeah, okay. My friend who did walk in on me watching it was like, oh, Roy Andersson, right on. So
there goes my theory.
Yeah, he'd watched it in film school and has actually referenced his commercials pretty often, which I did take a tiny bit to watch a few of them. They're very much in the style of this film, it feels like. Usually a one long take with a central kind of gag, because this is a comedy, I think, pretty directly. It is dealing with tragedy and like a tragicomedy or whatever you want to call it.
This is what they find funny in Sweden.
It's a series of slices of life of a bunch of Swedish people dealing with both mundanity and purpose in film, and struggling with their dreams and realities, I guess. I
think that's, yeah. I mean, honestly, I think that's enough prep to talk about the movie. Roy Andersson's obviously done a couple of these. I did actually watch his follow-up, A Pigeon Sits on a Branch Reflecting on Existence, which is a great title, and you would assume a pretentious film. I asked Dr. Porter actually which one he would like to cover, and he doubled down on You the Living, which you described as more rewarding. I agree, but I'm not sure why. Because A Pigeon is definitely a version of this film that flies off the rails. King of Sweden shows up in the middle of it. It's organized the same way, and then suddenly there's a bunch of men in old colonial garbs and horses who are very much 600 years out of place.
So it's like going back in time to...
No, they are out of time. They are in a bar in Sweden.
Oh,
a
okay.
modern bar.
Sure.
The first one that he did is called, in this style, is called Songs from the Second Floor. And that was the one that really convinced me to go see You the Living at Vancouver. But Songs from the Second Floor has a main character, and he has kind of these misadventures. It's just a guy that Roy Anderson saw in IKEA and then cast him because he looked a particular way.
That's the most Swedish story I've ever heard.
Yeah. And so he did that. And then I find You the Living to be the most interesting of his films, the most rewarding of his films, as Sage said. And part of it is because he starts with a Goethe quote about you, the living, and you don't really appreciate what you have. And that's something that people need to do more, I suspect. Has this dreamlike quality. There are lots of vignettes that are really dreams. And so that licenses the really out there things that he is able to do. But then there's also this bookend of these bombers. These bomber planes coming into Sweden. The man wakes up and he's really startled and he's like, I had this dream. And then he starts to talk to us. And right away, the film is just exploding your expectations of what a movie should do. And so there's, you start watching the film and someone is sleeping on a couch. Then he wakes up and he says, I'm having a dream. And then the rest of the film is the dream. But then he has dreams within dreams. And it becomes this really labyrinth piece. There's another thing in the Goethe quote about the river Lethe, which students almost never know what that means, which is from Plato, which is a river that everyone goes through when they die before their soul is reincarnated. And so you go through the river Lethe,
I put that together.
It cleanses your memory, but it doesn't cleanse it perfectly. And so some things you remember and some things you forget. And that's a really interesting story, a really interesting idea.
And that is the name of the town in this film.
Oh,
That's the name of the train that a lot of people get off kind of about a third of the way into the film. They get off of the Lethe, it says the Lethe line, and then they cross over the train tracks. And so there's all this piece. But the other thing I love about the movie is the woman who has just, I don't know what you would call it. She's in love with the guitar player. And then I also find his playing just astonishing.
The music throughout this movie is very charming and fun. We spend a lot of time with like a sousaphone player. There's like the guy practicing marching drums by himself, and it's all in like apartment complexes. So it's just, there's just no thought to the neighbors in so many of these scenes. Everyone is very self-involved, and not in like a way that they're shutting other people out. They just don't seem to notice anyone else is there.
Yeah,
so much
except for
time.
us, the people watching, because a lot of the time they're talking directly to the camera.
True. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the opening scene. So the guy wakes up, and then we see his neighbor playing the tuba. Then we see, that scene, and then we see someone else like getting mad about the tuba. Then we see somebody watching the person get mad about the tuba, and it all connects together. It's a network narrative, a web of life narrative, which I'm also a sucker for those. Like, give me what the formal is called roughened form. Like, I want to. It's very simple in its immediacy, but then you have to there are all these narrative threads and how everything connects together. I would love to see the plot layout for this particular film. Like, how do all these things work? Yeah, the map, because it's just terrific. And then again, there are just so many scenes that are classic. Like, again, the tablecloth trick scene is a classic scene, but then also when his lawyer is crying on the courtroom and the judge is like, no amount of tears is going to save your client. And then somebody brings beer into the judges. It's just the whole absurd nightmare thing about what things could be, or what the things that we worry about, like the hopes and dreams that people have. And to me, it's just a very, I don't know, it's disarming in a way. And if you can engage with it it's disarming but demanding at the same time. It's hard to kind of put your finger on how the film works. But if you can watch it in the green room, but if you can be stuck in front of a print of it, and when I was doing some research on this, there's a 4K version of this.
Ooh.
4K restoration, and that's going to look amazing.
That is not the trailer. What we watched.
The trailer for the 4K version looks amazing. I'm like, okay, I will travel to the ends of the earth to see this movie, which might be what happens, which should be fine. I'm due for some travel. But if you watch it from a DVD, you're not going to get the same if you're watching it from 720 or 480. It's just not going to be the same. But when you can see it in like a 4K or again a 35 millimeter print, you can look here, you can look there, you can look somewhere else. You can look at like 8 or 9 different things at the same time, and it's just you're going to get something different out of the film every time you watch it.
It's all intentionally very deep focus. So it really is up to it's play-like in a certain sense, but it doesn't. And even though it is very staged and very clearly with that intent, it doesn't feel as staged. We've been talking some about like movies that feel like theater. And this does feel like a movie to me. It doesn't feel like theater, actually. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I'm going to have to think about that.
Well, I have a theory that kind of goes to what both of you have just said. And I think I've never really seen absurdism told without like the use of cinematography. I mean, just putting the camera and letting it play is a cinematography choice. But we're used to having editing and having camera angles like really inform a world for anything where we see absurdism. I'm thinking of like someone coming in and putting, beer for the judges, or any of the other wonderful scenes in this movie where things happen that just don't happen in real life, regardless of whether it's a dream sequence or something that's quote unquote in the actual reality of this world. I think that's what's like startling and different is there's not a close-up of the beer. There's not highlighting. There's just a bunch of things happening. And one thing that stuck out to me in A Pigeon, which in a scene where someone is trying to sell vampire teeth or funny masks at a bar, there's just 2 people who their job is to just make out in the background the whole time. I mean, that's a thing you can... There's certainly sight gags in a lot of... In black comedies, characters in a scene who just have like one task, but you have to choose when to show them and what angles and everything. You can't show them all the time when you're cutting around. One thing I really wanted to touch on is the first thing they taught us in the production arm of Eastern Washington University was really the difference between deep and shallow focus and how to do that. Our first assignment was a photography assignment, and it was just to take different pictures focusing on those. But what they didn't do immediately was examine that there's a real philosophical idea behind using shallow or deep focus with what you want someone to see and what you're allowing them to see. So Gavin, as we get really into our film school bullshit, I want to ask you, do the names Arnheim or Bazin mean anything? Names that I'm sure I mispronounced because I haven't used them in 15 years.
I'm not drawing direct correlations, no.
Porter, I would love to tag you in for this.
Yeah, so you said Arnheim, right? But I think it's usually said Bazin.
Yeah, I knew that was the one I knew I was wrong on.
But Bazin, his essay is the one that you're really channeling right now and thinking about deep focus versus shallow focus. And that was just a groundbreaking essay, The Evolution of the Language of Cinema. And Bazin was really writing in response to Italian neorealism, which is a shot on location style of realism, but also kind of counterintuitively Citizen Kane. He thought Citizen Kane was just an amazing film, and it led people to re-examine, or he was at least part of that re-examination of Citizen Kane, which didn't enjoy the reputation that it had until after Bazin, until after people started to really think about it more seriously. But if you look at Citizen Kane, now we take it for granted that he has all of these tableaus, like you just set it up and that's where it goes. And these super long takes with a static camera or maybe the slightly moving camera or something like that. And Bazin thought that was just an amazing way to shoot a scene because, in effect, you're saying, I'm going to lay out what this scene looks like, but your attention as the spectator is going to be where the meaning of the scene exists.
Yeah.
And so the film and the spectator into a collaboration where the spectator is enabled to make their significance of the image themselves rather than to be directed to what the significance is constantly. And of course, Citizen Kane uses all kinds of cutting in other scenes, but for a large portion of the film, it is just a single take style. And of course, there are other filmmakers later on, like Jacques Tati is a really well-known one, like Playtime, where he does the same thing. My uncle, and those are setting up the camera, letting things go, and then you have to decide as the spectator what you're going to look at. And there's something, I don't know, psychologically rewarding to feel like you're part of the joke, if you will. And that to me is part of the charm of You the Living, because if you don't notice, as Sage pointed out, the two people making out in the background of what looks like a completely unrelated drama, then you're invited to compare those two things, like the people making out in the scene versus the people who are not making out in the scene. They're just having a conversation, like, and how all those things work. But one of the things that's been studied in Citizen Kane is how he very often has three points of interest in every single image that lasts for any duration. And so Anderson is frequently doing that, building things to the camera. And everybody does that at this point, I'm sure, who's building their own sets, like especially even special effects, heavy films like Lord of the Rings, like they're building their set and they're building their matte paintings. They're building all these things because this is where the camera's going to be and this is where the actors are going to be. And they build it as small as possible to use the fewest possible materials, and they make it as economically as possible. Those are the things that Arnheim, from an aesthetic point of view, Arnheim wasn't really in favor of long takes, but if it serves an effect, then he was in favor of it. Zan basically said, here's the effect of this particular aesthetic, and here's why this is a really preferable to the other kind of effect, other kind of aesthetic styles, because it involves the spectator in a way that they are meaningfully part of the art.
Yeah, I mean, those are two, I'm not even going to call them competing philosophies because they intermingle so much and so much great arts, but I always think of it as the responsibility of the filmmaker. Arnheim believed that you should direct the viewer's eyes, and Bazin thought you should, I'm going to keep pronouncing it wrong. He believed that it was the responsibility to allow the viewer to look at what they wanted. And the thing that always stuck with me that you mentioned once was Bazin was pretty religious, and he thought reality was already authored. So it's somewhat rude. I don't want to go so far as to say heresy, but like, why would you author it again? Who are you? Who are you to author reality?
Yeah,
Just show it.
That's my understanding. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on Bazin, but I do think that part of his philosophy is sometimes lost. So if you think that the world is authored by a creator, then you, as the filmmaker, your job is really to reflect the creation, which there can be nothing greater than. Not to cut it up into your own interpretation, but to allow people to see through your art, to see what was created, if that makes sense.
Gavin, at this point, I would love it if you clicked the making of that I sent you and just kind of put that on in the background. I did my best to give Gavin the same experience that you gave us, which is just, here's a film, no context. It's Swedish. It's going to be longer takes with a static camera. But I think the thing that makes this movie special is hidden behind that. And it was fun to watch this with new context, which is just everything in this movie is fake.
Yeah.
We've touched on that, and I know you got it spoiled for you a little bit.
Right. I think I'd kind of, maybe my buddy was talking to me about he's just like because again, we're shooting at a very deep stop. We're shooting inside in a studio.
Everything is inside the studio, including the things that are outside.
And to get a large stop. Well, and that was really clear. I mean, from the very beginning, there's that scene on the bench with
I didn't catch that.
The couple. I mean, every time you're looking out a window, it looks like a painting, and everything looks like a painting, including the interiors. It's all very much laid out with like this depth that I don't know what period of art that is, but like it screams like painting to me over and over again. And part of that is the blocking as well is very conscious that like even in large crowd scenes, it does feel like you can see everyone. And, you know, as you said, it is all pointed towards one specific camera point of view, and generally occasionally the camera will move, But predominantly it is locked off static camera with people moving, even, and they're not even moving big in the scene. It's mostly like small shuffles, because
Yeah.
I think that's Swedish life. It's just shuffling. Yeah, thinking about the amount of light that you've got to get, even for like some of these situations that look kind of dim, and there's like night scenes and kitchens and stuff, you're still trying to expose for like probably an f8 or something. I don't know how wide lenses they're on, but he's never trying to guide the eye, like we were saying with the aperture. It's all with performance and with story, like character motivated storytelling.
But at the same time, like if you've got, because there's a ton of forced perspective as you go further in this 8-minute short that I'll show you, they'll start like dollying out, and there's just like the ceiling's actually just 3 feet above the camera, and it's held with a C-stand.
Nice.
So everything is, that authored choice. You say it's not directing your eye, but the fact that you have a ceiling at all is directing your eye.
Right.
I don't know. I've still never landed on like what I'm trying to say with this, but that's why I find this film so fascinating and wanted to revisit it.
And I was pretty bummed that I did have to. You were talking about seeing this in 35, and I was watching this on Canopy, which is a great network and stuff, but it's just a DVD transfer and then streaming a DVD transfer. So I would love to see this in a big screen. I got to see Playtime in its most recent restoration as it was playing theaters. And so much of that like controlled, but like wider frames with a lot of things to look at and take in. This is like one of the biggest arguments for high resolution I've ever seen. It was a little bit of a bummer to watch this on DVD compared to like what I know the detail I could have gotten.
Yeah, the Canopy version does not do the print justice, and it'll be great when a 4K version of this finally comes out. It finally gets distributed.
Yeah, I'll watch it again. I'm not going to go to the ends of the earth, but like I'll put it if they replace it on Canopy or sell it at a reasonable price.
I'm looking for any excuse to go back to Sweden. That'd be fine too.
I guess we never ended up covering it, but we had an episode planned for the fall, and the fall Mubi just figured out the rights to it. They put it back in theaters. I got to watch that movie in theaters. It was an incredible experience, and now it's streaming on Mubi, and next year there will be a 4K re-release. And this was like a pretty popular, famous movie, but it's just been somewhat out of print. And there's always been the option to buy the Blu-ray off of Amazon or wherever for like $130. And even for one of my favorite movies, I'm not going to do that. The point I'm making is I will not be buying You the Living for $130.
It'll play somewhere.
Yeah,
in a revival or at the museum or something like that.
Do you know what's happened with Roy Andersson post Pigeon?
I just watched his latest, which was from 2019. It's called About Endlessness. So I might need to watch it again.
It sounds like he's still examining the same themes.
Yeah, it's examining similar themes and similar ideas and similar style. And so, sometimes when you find your style, it's just your style and you write it, and there you go. So he still has new things to say. And I think that I'm not tuned in enough to figure out what those are quite yet. I'm probably, to confess a little bit, I'm the worst first film viewer of all time. Like the first time I see a movie, I'm like, that was interesting, but I got nothing. So I've only watched About Endlessness once. I really need to watch things twice to really like them. But if I watch something a second time and I like it, like I really like it, like the prototype example for that for me was Fantastic Mr. Fox, which I saw in the cinema, and I was like, oh, that was okay. And then I watched it again when it came out on home video, and I was like, that was amazing. I was like, what are you thinking? That was okay.
Well, you've described the entire reason that we have this podcast.
Yeah, through revisiting things the second time that maybe you missed. So
yeah,
I would definitely put You the Living up there. And again, thinking about it in terms of what it's doing, how it does it, why why he's doing the same thing again. His style is really interesting. I would love to see what he would do if you're like, okay, Roy, now I need you to actually make a cut into the scene.
If you got American producers involved.
Yeah, would it kill you to use a master shot technique and cut into a close up? And he probably would say no, because then now I'm telling the audience where to look, and I don't want to tell the audience where to look. If I want the audience to look at the key in Alicia's hand, I'm not going to use a dolly like Hitchcock did in Notorious. I'm going to have her be the only thing moving in the scene, or
Yeah.
whatever the case might be. So there are different poetic ways to solve narrative complexity issues, and that I really appreciate what Roy has done in that respect, in trying to figure out, okay, how do I explore a completely divergent aesthetic, and an aesthetic that requires that the audience look at what they want to look at, but at the same time, how do I get them to look where I want them to look?
If I had to guess, he would just have the keys jingle in her hand while she delivers a long monologue about being disappointed by life.
That's possible. That's possible.
Sage had made an offhand joke about how this was Swedish Wes Anderson. So it's interesting that you bring up
Same
Fantastic Mr. Fox, because it is very similar. When I'm shooting, I like to look into the corners of rooms and like trying to find depth and planes.
And boom shadows.
And boom shadows, yeah. Always light from above and tell your boom operator to stand right in front of a source. Roy Anderson doesn't seem to be shooting directly at a wall most of the time. It's always at an angle. It's always slightly above hip level. Similar to Wes Anderson, there are ways to create depth, but at a certain point, you're relying mostly on production design and blocking. And those are very powerful ways to make a vibrant image full of depth. They are just not things that the cinematographer has direct control over the same way. And so I've always been nervous about that version of working, because it's just putting so much trust in your collaborators. And whenever it works, it pays off. And it's some of like the best times I've had on set, when I'm like, this is incredible. And all I'm doing is getting to support like someone else is the star. And I'd say with his stuff, the production design and the blocking specifically are the stars, which you'd mentioned cinematography a bunch, Sage. And I'm just like, yes.
Well, and the cinematography is the choice of where to put the camera, and to a lesser extent, what lights to put in.
Yeah.
And sound's almost treated the same way in it, despite like the music going through. I think that was captured live. I could see that in behind the scenes. But I'll tell you, I accidentally put on an Italian dub of this film, which is on YouTube, and decided to watch it for like 15 minutes. And what struck me is like, it's perfectly mixed, which makes me think most of the sound is done separately and then the dialogue track put over. Maybe even the Swedish version is full ADR. Dr. Porter, I don't know if you know anything about this. It did win a lot of sound awards, and that would be a reason for it.
I could be wrong. I would guess that if you're shooting in the studio, one of the reasons that you would do that is so that you'd have full control over the sound on the stage, but who knows?
Yeah, well, I just see like a bunch of shotguns like out to the side.
Sure.
Which I guess they're showing off the scene, so this isn't like a true behind-the-scenes stuff. But I would say the biggest advantage of having a static camera is you could just paint out booms. You could just plant things. You could do what they did in Zone of Interest, is actually a somewhat comparable film to this. It does a lot of the same things, where it just sets cameras and lets actors act, although that's with a degree of improvisation that is probably less present in this film. But they painted out cameras. They had plant mics everywhere, in addition to, obviously, nowadays we put a lav on every single actor, no matter what, just in case, unless they're not wearing a shirt. But additionally, plant mics, and it's just painted out because it's easy to do that with nice static images. And even in 2007, that was pretty easy to do.
Well, one of the scenes I'd love to talk about just specifically is we talked about the girl in the bar cafe place who's in love with the rock and roll guitarist and singer. Mm-hmm. And when she's dreaming about their post-marriage like life together, there's this crazy scene I think it's shot in their kitchen looking into their bedroom, where she's slowly taking off her wedding gown and he's playing guitar at the table, and outside it's night or like darkish. And I didn't notice it for a while. There was like a light moving in the distance outside, and I was like, that's kind of weird. And then there was a tree that went by, and I was like, that's weird. And then more trees went by and more lights went by, and all of a sudden you realize that their house is a train. And this is like he's done
sometimes your house is a train.
He's done some stuff in this movie that like occasionally there's the people on the park bench, it's very clear that like there's this pink sunset light that's a version of reality, but very clearly fake. And the distance, like you can see it, it is a painting, and it becomes two-dimensional even with the depth. But this was the most depth I think I'd seen in the film. And then it turns into them pulling into a train station, and there's a crowd of people talking through their living room window. This is also one of the places where we get a reverse shot, which you don't get too often in this film, where they're looking now over the crowd into their apartment as they say their goodbyes and pull away. He's also playing what I would assume. It looks like they're recording that guitar live. All the fingering makes sense. It looks like he's actually playing, which means that
that's a much easier one to do. That's just a chord going into a mixer.
I guess that's the way you do that. I was just thinking, like, it's all mixed very well, where you have the crowd outside don't sound too loud, the people inside, everything just sounds like the right amount of balance. So that on top of a large technical feat of what I thought was just a projection outside, but no, there's crowd of people also. I'm still wrapping my head around that shot.
Yeah.
That would be if when I meet Roy Andersson, that will be the shot that I ask him about. Like, how did you do that? And it's partly because if you track down the making of this film, you can see, oh, that's how they built that set. That's how they built that set. That's how they built that set. But then it's really hard to explain how the window outside the apartment train thing keeps going forever.
Yeah.
Like, is that in a circle? I guess it could be in a circle. It's just, how big is this studio that he's, how big is Studio 24? It's got to be like 7 football fields or something.
Are they having multiple of these sets built at the same time? Or are they having to like cut them down once they're put through and like having a whole re-rig day?
Even you would assume that it's kind of a green screen behind the window because it's been going on forever, but then it's not.
Yeah.
And so, and then again, then he creates the reverse shot. It's like he built an entire train station somehow, at least one level of a train station. And again, the production designer and set construction folks on this are just mind-bogglingly good at what they do. I'm not really sure how you do that.
You said that you would, your question to Roy Andersson would be how. My question would still be why? Because the most fascinating thing about this from a metatextual element is that why would you put all this extra work in? Like, it would be cheaper to film it in real locations. Some of these you need to build something and tell the specific thing you want to say, but like the bench outside, just film that outside. You have a little bit less control, but like, isn't that okay? The point is, he's not even choosing the cheaper alternative when it could theoretically be better. He's making a choice to tell this in arguably the most expensive way possible, and there's not even green screen. And I'm not making judgments one way or the other, but the question remains why.
Can't argue with results, Sage.
But anyway, you cheated and looked something up, even though I told you to do no research.
Yeah. Well, I was talking with my buddy again, and he was talking about the amount of lighting and the amount of set builds, and one thing I saw was that this film was shot over like 3 years of building and tearing down sets, and he's doing like 40 or 50 takes per on a good day, it sounds like. And he's using a lot of non-actors, which I'm sure, first of all, gets him the tone that he's looking for. Like, a lot of the performances feel very non-actor, or maybe just Swedish. I don't know. But
you don't know.
But I think that is part of what he's trying to get is...
Yeah, it's the value of unity. So you have an aesthetic, and once you choose it for any scene, you have to do it for every scene, even if it's completely counterintuitive to shoot an exterior as an interior, or to build the outside world as an interior. And one of the final shots in the film is the young woman who had a dream about marrying Mickey the guitarist, like on a hill next to a radio tower or electrical tower or something like that. And again, that's also, you find out from the making of that's also a set. You kind of go, okay, wow, that's quite impressive. I think that he probably doesn't build anything that's not going to be in the frame, so then he's not spending that money. So back in the Hollywood day, you wouldn't necessarily know where the camera goes, so you had to build the whole Oz. But he's definitely planning to only shoot this small portion, so he only builds what he needs, lights what he needs, and sound records what he needs. I think that it's, for some reason, it reminds me of German Expressionism, where they just planned everything down to the last detail and then shot it in the studio because they wanted that particular claustrophobic feeling, the same texture, the same level of control that you could have. And so whereas we would typically think about German Expressionism as being a horror genre, Roy Andersson has kind of taken that aesthetic and turned it into maybe a horror comedy, or maybe an absurdist horror comedy, as Sage might allow. So
I'll allow it.
These are really interesting. Yeah.
Well, I'd offer as a counterpoint that no, you don't have to make it that way. But I'm very glad that someone did.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm at.
The whole film really stitches together all these various people. Again, to me, it's just like one really rewarding vignette after another. I don't know how, again, I've chosen a favorite, but they're all just tremendous. And then how they're all very, what's the word I want? They all seem very unique and personal, like every character is searching for other things. But I loved what Gavin said earlier about how they feel connected, but they don't feel connected at the same time. Like there's this aloofness to them. And it's part of that's the aesthetic of, I'm never going to give you a close-up of this person reacting to anything. And that's kind of what we've been conditioned to wait for. And this film really withholds that. But I find the film to be super rewarding, and I'm really excited to find out that it's coming out in a 4K version, because I think that this is definitely, as you said, like looking back at things that maybe we missed before, or maybe we never had a chance to see. Like, I would definitely say wait until the 4K version of this comes out if you haven't seen the film, because that 4K version is going to really reward your waiting, but also reward the energy that you give to it and that you put into it.
Yeah, I do want to say, like, Canopy's awesome for having it at all, but that it was
props.
Little bit of a bummer. I was like, this feels like a poor DVD transfer.
Yeah, and I think even though a pigeon sitting on I can't even remember the full title, his follow-up,
Pigeon sat on a branch contemplating existence. Yeah,
was 2013. I feel like the scan I watched of that was also ripped from a DVD at 720.
They had Apple had a 4K version at one point, I feel like, but maybe not.
Potentially.
About Endlessness looks pretty good. I watched that and didn't feel like I was watching an inferior version. So that looks
you're
really
postulating a world where we can spend $4 on the movies we watch at this podcast.
Oh, okay.
Which sometimes
That's
we do
true.
if there's really no other option. So, Gavin,
that's me.
We have a patented and famous 3-tier rating system for everything that we cover on this podcast.
Correct.
And it never changes.
No.
Would you like to describe to our guests how we cast judgment?
Do we say it is still good? Is it something that's better as a memory? Maybe like the first time you watched it, it meant something, and now you're kind of like, it means less. I wish I could go back. Or do we, I guess, put it in the electric chair and heat up some popcorn? Would be the lowest tier out of the three.
So forget about it would be tier 3.
Pretend it doesn't exist is the classic one. Do we never speak of it again?
Bury it in a shallow grave and never speak of it again.
Yeah. But usually Gavin comes up with something while he's talking, and this time he did not.
The electric chair with popcorn counts.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. This was my first time watching it, but I enjoyed it. I found it I still good. There are movies in this, like I'd said, gotten to see Jacques Tati's Playland on the big screen, which was an amazing way. With this type of movie too, it does help to be in a place that, you're getting to explore the frame with your eyes and you're devoid of other distractions. Being in a darkened theater would have been amazing for this. I'm very jealous. But I still enjoyed it despite the situation I was watching it in. I found it very charming, and the craft is next level. Like you said, despite maybe it not needing to be, I think that was part of the fabric that made it like great. So I really enjoyed it. Still good.
Where did you see Playtime, Gavin?
So I had a buddy. I didn't know what it was. I went into that entirely blind. A friend of ours who's been on the podcast, Andrew Calloway, was a fan of it, and it was during a re-release. I believe it might have been playing. This might have been in New York at either the Nighthawk or something like that out there. But it did an art house run with whatever re-release it had, and it looked great, and it was deeply charming. Has a lot of similarities to this film in that it is, again, pretty removed, and you're just watching. Actually the deepest connection I saw which was a scene that we didn't talk about, but I really enjoyed, was the gentleman with all the baggage trying to get to the teller at the train station.
That was my number 2 pick.
And every time he's in one of 2 queues, and when the other one empties, he like picks up his bag, but someone rushes in front of him and takes his place. And then as he goes back to where he was before, another person goes in front of him. So it's kind of like Sisyphus trying to get to the window to buy a train ticket. But every time he takes a step forward, he winds up taking 2 steps back, which a lot of Playland is people in situations where the modern world has attempted to make something more achievable and easy, but has just added layers of confusion in front of what should be simple tasks. And it's deeply enjoyable to watch someone feel as lost and confused in the modern world as we often do.
Yeah, I can see that sequence taking 40 takes
Sure.
to just get all the
and that is like
timing right.
that is perfection, like timing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes me wonder how many times did they do that. But the reason I asked about, where Playtime played is because you could,
Was it Playland or
lobby
Playtime? I keep forgetting.
Playtime. So you
Yeah.
could lobby whoever in LA who showed it, but maybe they didn't show it. But and I haven't been in LA for so long, I wouldn't even know where they would play
shout
like
out
revival
Vidiots.
stuff.
Give them enough
Yeah, it
emails. I'm
sounds like
sure
a
Vidiots will play it.
We've got quite a few theaters down here that are focused on showing not just classic, but just kind of like weirder and more obscure films.
It is wonderful, and that's part of the. Again, we should hit up Vidiots and tell them we love them. But it's cool when a theater can garner its own version of trust, where you trust the curation there to a point where you'll just go see something you don't know about.
Maybe they'll let us do a live podcast in their micro cinema.
Maybe.
So I didn't like this movie when I first saw it. Like, with no preparation as a 20-year-old, I found this grueling and annoying and not funny. And it is such a treat to see it 15 years later, because that kid was incorrect. And I think the biggest variables in that change are a deeper appreciation for when a film is just telling a story differently. I had such an idea in my head at 20 of like, this is what a film should be to be acceptable, to not annoy me, to be rewarding. And now I've just seen so many films that if a film is doing something so different, and I don't consider that inept, I would think about like, well, Megalopolis was different, but that was also just an inept film.
Still really want to see that. But
yeah, I'm not going to tell you not to. It's just, it's bad. It's badly made. Not to get on a tangent of that. And then the other thing that's changed in my life is through traveling. I haven't been to Sweden yet, but I have befriended so many Swedish people, and like, I get this style of Nordic humor more than I did in college, where aside from a couple sequences, I didn't find funny. And now this film is it's just delightful to sit back and chuckle. So this film is absolutely still good.
I would definitely condone that point of view. I think it's still good. I think that it's from a different era of movie making in some respects. Like, is anyone making movies like this now? Other than Roy Andersson, has anyone ever made movies like this? They have, but it's a different form of attention. It's kind of a challenge to think back to 2007, 2008, 2009, and what the movies were like. Again,
it does not feel like a 2007 movie to me. That was interesting. But yeah, sorry.
Thinking about again, having watched this on 35 millimeter, this is before everything was converted to digital, was just a different kind of aesthetic in so many different ways, kind of a different film culture, how that changes. I mean, you would absolutely never recommend watching You the Living on your phone. It's just not going to work. It's a film that really needs to be enjoyed on a larger screen with, again, the highest resolution possible. I've had a similar experience, Sage, with Citizen Kane. So when we watched Citizen Kane, when I was in film school, more than 2008, 2009, this would have been like in the 90s, even late 80s. And so watched Citizen Kane, but we watched it from a VHS tape, which has the right aspect ratio, but the film itself doesn't look very good at all. And then we had a film society on campus who brought in a 16 millimeter print of Citizen Kane, and you watch the 16 millimeter print, with a projector on a larger screen, and you just can notice a completely different, not a completely different film because it's technically the same film, but it's a very different experience of the film. And so that can be really important as well. Just the experience of it. And again, how we consume more movies now than we did then, but we consume them very differently than we did. It's different. It's not necessarily better or worse, but I do think that some films are built for a particular kind of movie experience, and that's what You the Living is built for, is a particular kind of movie experience. Again, if you have the funds to go and see the movie on the big screen, is something that's always more rewarding. The other piece too is that this is a comedy, but I can definitely imagine somebody who's like, what is going on in this movie? But if there's one person in that crowd of 5 or 10 people who's like, this is hilarious, then everybody's like, this is hilarious. So the example for that I often think about is when I watch There's Something About Mary at home, I was like, this movie is just dumb. But then when you watch it with an audience and they're like, oh, but it's dumb, but it's hysterical at the same time. And you just have to give yourself over to that kind of aesthetic. Like movies as a group experience is quite different.
I watched Anora last night, which excellent film. Always going to recommend it. And there was one person in the audience who found it much funnier than everyone else.
Oh no!
Which I would argue that movie is objectively pretty funny, but one guy was on a different wavelength, and I still haven't figured out if that improved or lessened my experience of seeing it, because it could go either way.
Unique laughs are tough in a theater. It can really make or break an experience.
Absolutely.
That's true.
Well, the last thing I want to touch on, we often will pretend that we have the rights to these series and reboot them. Okay, so here's the question that I did want to ask is, how would you sell this type of project to a broader American audience? And I think the answer might just be what Robert Zemeckis is doing with Here, which is make it extravagant, make it an epic across time, throw beautiful, lighting and visual effects at it, and de-age Tom Hanks and make it an event through all these other ways. I'm curious if y'all have any other ideas of, if you were tasked with making this, but you weren't making it for you, Roy Anderson.
I would make it for less money so that the losses are less great.
I would make this movie for $120,000. Yes,
that would be my I mean, because the thing is that you can now find an audience in ways that are pretty unique and probably a little bit simpler than 2007 in terms of just getting things out there. You don't have to ship around a 35 millimeter print. You can put it on the internet. You can, and then that can be
this could have been like
anywhere.
I'm surprised there's not like a Roy Anderson Netflix original movie or something where they're like, yeah, here's $4 billion, do whatever you want.
Well, I mean, clearly he's still making movies, and I know we'd mentioned that he's a prolific commercial director, and it seems like, honestly, watching several of his commercials, they seem like the type of commercial that are kind of fulfilling as a job. Like, it does seem like he really gets to practice his version of craft. It's the same way that like when Wes Anderson or Spike Jonze does a commercial, yes, they're like, to the end isn't going to be the same as them doing their own feature, but they do bring an imaginative and specifically like whole cloth their viewpoint to the projects they're making, even when it is a commercial buyout. So that's really cool.
Yeah, how you would remake it, you would start with a smaller budget so that your losses were smaller in the end. Yeah, that's an interesting possibility. Again, I mean, I wouldn't remake this, but how would you work in this style? Like if someone came to you and said, "Here's my script, I want to shoot it like a Roy Anderson movie."
Yeah, not literally remaking this
would
movie scene for scene, but like
what's
another.
What's gonna make me not pass?
Yeah, an unpublished
And
Roy
if-
Anderson manuscript.
Yeah, we need to bring this to the big screen. That's a good question. I would just find somebody who really liked Roy Anderson and ask them for a few $1 million, and then I'd be done. That's what I would do.
I think the closest equivalent that we have for an American audience would probably be those Roald Dahl movies, the shorts that Wes Anderson made for Netflix. I like some of them and I hate some of them, but they're all very much like, I mean, the camera moves in the Wes Anderson style, but it's like almost like it's reframing. You know, it goes through a dolly and then you have a new frame and it's full of people talking to the audience and explaining things, although they're explaining plot. It's a lot. I've never seen a movie talk more to the audience than any of those Roald Dahl shorts. They're a treat, and they do make me want to revisit Fantastic Mr. Fox, a movie I did not care for when I saw it in high school.
I love that movie. I also From the Gate it's one of my favorites of his.
In general, I didn't care for most Wes Anderson, and I've softened on that. And there's some more recent stuff. Like I'll go see every Wes Anderson film in theaters, the schedule allowing. Whereas there was a long part of my life where I was just skipping that. Like I said, I find it rewarding that he's just doing things in a different way, even if that different way isn't my preferred style of filmmaking.
Sure.
And there's a lot of overlap in those aesthetics, even with the palette.
Yeah.
The way that it's lit, the way that it's staged. So there's a lot of that. But again, they're both kind of, and by reputation, control freaks. Like they are going to control every little thing. Like I've heard rumors that Wes Anderson will go through like dozens of iterations of a puppet before he's happy with that puppet. And that's just like, I have such a vision of what this is going to be. But then even the final product and the way that is very painterly, as Gavin mentioned earlier, and very muted. But also there seems to me to be a similar aesthetic in terms of breaking the fourth wall. Like the overt aesthetic really makes you think about, really engages you in a way. Like I'm not trying to deceive you here. You know, this is not a real world. It's just a very different feeling than a lot of other filmmakers. Like contrast that with like 1917, where that's just, you know, single take, goes for, you know, an hour plus. And it's one take, but it's a moving frame that's constantly going. But that really is a different kind of immersion. And that's kind of what I've been thinking about a lot, about immersion and engagement and how that happens, and how, again, I mentioned the orientation effect earlier. Like your brain has to reset every time it sees a completely different image. But I don't know that I would remake this, just like I wouldn't remake 2001. It's like a perfect movie. You just don't mess around with that.
Yeah.
But you could definitely it'd be fun to make a parody of a Roy Anderson movie, like it, you know, like in that
this
style.
Not a parody of a Roy Anderson movie?
Yeah. It's already kind of,
it's
again,
like
I
the way
think
that
you could do it.
Like how do you satirize this?
There's a movie that's called there's a movie called Shout that is a parody of Scream, and I've never seen anything more misguided.
Was that the Shout, if you know what I did? It's like
maybe
their scary movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just like it's already a parody.
Yeah.
I'm always happy when there's kind of a counter cinema, because that's really important to learning different techniques, learning different ideas. Like there's more than one way to stage a scene. There's more than one way to move a camera. There's more than one way to not move a camera. Well, I guess there's probably by definition only one way to not move a camera. It's not moving the camera. But it's the same idea. Like some people are either conforming to what's typically done, or they're exploring the territory. And I feel like Roy Anderson is just on a different planet, that people are kind of, they can use his style or they can not use his style, but his style is out there, and that's good to have an alternative.
Well, thank you so much for stopping by, Dr. Porter. It's such a pleasure to see you again. What are your books and where can we buy them?
Well, my books are not out yet, and there's only one so
Never
far,
mind.
although I have another one that's brewing in my head. So the one I'm doing is about animal movies since 2000, since basically Winged Migration through March of the Penguins and Grizzly Man and some other films all the way up to My Octopus Teacher. So that film
Oh,
or that
okay.
book is again being read right now to see if it should move forward.
I was thinking that was more in the vein of like the digital monkey from Nope.
That'll be a good one too. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I give a mention of that, but yeah.
But you described a lot of uses of actual animals and films focused. If it wasn't
Yeah.
post 2000, I'm assuming you would write about Roar.
I did not write about Roar. When was that?
I mean, 80s.
Oh, you
or
mean
maybe
the
late
old
70s.
one? No, I did not write about Roar. That's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah, yeah. I guess that's a pretty covered movie.
I'm arguing that there's a new kind of aesthetic, basically taking a somewhat Bazanian approach, that there's a new aesthetic because people wanted to make films that were more attentive to animals and how they live and what they really do versus forcing them into human narratives. But also the camera things, the different digital tools that we have now, you can make a movie that's more based in animals than you could ever before. So that's kind of my argument.
Well, if you want to hear more from Dr. Porter, you can enroll in film school
There you go.
at Eastern Washington University. We're still good, Pod. We're still doing this, and we're prepping for a pretty fun season 3 next year. You can find us on various socials at Still Good Pod. Send us an email at stillgoodpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you about what works from the podcast and what you might want going forward. All right, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in a few weeks for Gladiator.